evening, and thank you for coming. I want to start by clearing up any confusion that, in spite of my outfit, I am not Rick Santorum. Rick is in South Carolina right now. He has other things on his mind. My name is Ed Joyce, and I am the president of the Delaware Valley chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And before I introduce our speaker, John Seager, I want to take a few minutes to tell you about Americans United and specifically about the Delaware Valley chapter to let you know about some of the things that we do. Americans United for Separation of Church and State was founded almost 70 years ago by a coalition of educators, religious leaders, and civic leaders for the sole purpose of guaranteeing all American citizens their right to practice a religion of their choice or refrain from practicing as their conscience dictates. Our home office, Americans United, is in Washington, D.C., and we have over 80,000 members spread out across 44 states, represented by 66 chapters. You might wonder what the big deal is about church-state separation. Well, when you think about it, a lot of the issues that face us today as a nation have their roots in church-state separation issues. Issues like marriage equality, reproductive rights, the controversy over creationism versus evolution in our schools, school vouchers, and many other issues are all tied into church-state separation. We are the only national group that focuses 100% of our time and energy to church-state separation issues, and it's important that Americans United is up there fighting for religious liberties because, believe me, there are many well-founded, powerful groups today that would like to do nothing better than to change our country's interpretation of what the separation of church and state means. So it's important that Americans United is out there upholding those values. I look at the long line of church-state cases handed down by the Supreme Court over the last 50 or 60 years, and while I don't agree with all of them, most of them are right on. Mandatory religious exercises have been removed from public schools. Direct government aid to religion has been banned, and all religions, Christian and non-Christian alike, have been placed on equal footing, and we have Americans United to thank for a lot of these successes. All you have to do is look at today's lineup of Republican candidates to know that we still have a lot of work to do. At least 3 of these candidates claim to have heard God speak to them to tell them that they should run for president. Stealing a line from our executive officer, our executive director, Barry Lynn says that at least 2 of these candidates are probably lying. Well, I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that perhaps they're not lying, perhaps they are hearing voices. Perhaps they are hallucinating, which personally I find is a scarier proposition than just that they might be fibbing a little. All politicians might fib a little, but I find that if they're hearing voices, I find that a pretty scary proposition. The Delaware Valley chapter of Americans United represents Americans United in the Delaware Valley, and we act as the constitutional eyes and ears for the national office, and we also educate. Some of the activities that we're involved in the Philadelphia and surrounding areas are we hold monthly meetings in Center City, Philadelphia, in Doylestown, and in South Jersey. We also sponsor and take part in debates, and our Vice President, Janice Rail, and myself were involved in 2 debates last year with the religious right. And I think that anybody who was there would have to agree that the good guys won those debates. We also speak regularly at churches and at civic groups, and we've been very much involved in the voucher issues both in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. And in case you don't know, in December, the Pennsylvania House voted down the voucher bill in Pennsylvania, and I think that Delaware Valley chapter can rightly take partial credit for that defeat. We had a letter campaign where we were writing in about our feelings about vouchers. We also held 2 debates on vouchers, and one included Senator Anthony Williams, who's a co-sponsor of Senate Bill 1, that was the voucher bill in Pennsylvania. So we held debates, and we also marched on Washington. So we did our part in ensuring that that bill was defeated. We also hold symposia every year, and the last symposia that we held here in Center City, Philadelphia, was at the National Constitution Center, and it was a real success. We had speakers from a wide geographic area speaking on a broad range of church-state issue topics. We hold events like the symposia because I feel strongly that Americans United has a mandate to ensure that this wisdom of church-state separation is passed on to successive generations. And I think everybody can see that if there aren't groups like Americans United passing this wisdom on, it will be lost or at least watered down. So it's important that we're out there fighting for these rights. And like I said, we are the only national group that spends 100% of our time and energy on church-state issues. So if you are not a member, please join and help us with our endeavors. If you are already a member, don't forget to renew. So with that, I am going to introduce our speaker. We're very fortunate to have John Seager with us tonight. John is the president and CEO of Population Connection. Since 1968, Population Connection has been a strong advocate for population stabilization by working to ensure that every woman around the world who wants to delay or end a pregnancy has access to health services. Prior to joining Population Connection, John served at the EPA. During the Clinton administration, he was chief of staff for former U.S. Representative Peter Kostmeyer. John is a graduate of Trinity College in Connecticut with a bachelor's degree in political science. John has traveled throughout the country making presentations on global population growth, and he has written widely on the subject with topics ranging from the links to poverty, future outcomes, and the concern about population decline in highly developed nations. With that, I'd like to introduce John Seager.
Thank you very much, and thank you especially to Americans United, not only for this opportunity, but for all the outstanding work that organization does. I cannot think of a single thing with which we would even, I think we'd have a hard time finding anything to even slightly disagree on. We do have a different focus, and I think it's important for organizations to pick what they do and do it better than anyone else, and that's what I think every organization strives to do, and you certainly do it in your area. I did work for a number of years for Congressman from the 70s through the 90s up in Bucks County named Peter Kostmeyer, who also had a very positive and reciprocal relationship with the folks from Americans United, because I think it's fair to say that he had an unblemished voting record on these issues. And occasionally I'd have to fill in for him because he'd be stuck in Washington for a vote or something. And I do remember one time somebody said early on, they said, you know, Congressman Kostmeyer couldn't be with us today, but we're sorry to say John Seager's here instead. But mostly I got pretty good introductions along the way. If Will Rogers is right that an expert, he said way back when that an expert is someone who is 50 miles from his own hometown and owns his own briefcase. The only thing that's changed is now it could be his or her briefcase, which is a big improvement. But therefore I do not qualify, because I actually, even though I work in Washington, D.C. and travel around the country, I actually live up in Percy in Bucks County and will be heading home tonight after this meeting. So it's nice not to be heading back to a Holiday Inn Express as I so often do. I want to start with a little story that has nothing to do with population whatsoever, but I think you'll find it of interest if you don't know it. And it's a family story. It involves a first cousin of mine, although, and he's, you know, this whole cousin thing gets very confusing. He was a first cousin twice removed, which means that he was my grandfather's first cousin. It was a man named Francis Bellamy. Now, in 1892, Francis Bellamy worked as a writer for a magazine called Youth's Companion, which was around for about 100 years. And one day, the powers that be came to him and said, we have a little writing assignment for you. What might that be? Well, there's this idea that students should, in classrooms, should have a pledge. And we thought we'd do it on the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. Now, some people actually think, and I've never been able to find any documentation on this, that the creation of this pledge, which came to be known as the Pledge of Allegiance, was really just a way to get classrooms to buy flags. There is a theory about that you can't pledge allegiance to a flag if you don't own one. I don't know about that, but he did take the commission and he proceeded to write a pledge. And I want to tell you what that pledge said. It said the following. This was his first draft. I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation with liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. Well, he turned that in. And they said, that's too French. Isn't it funny how things don't change? Because that was the rallying cry of the French Revolution. They said, no, 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 we're not going to be, you'll never get that past the state superintendents of education. Try again. So he went back to the drawing board or the writing table, and he came up with the following pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation with liberty and justice for all. And so it was accepted. And that's how the pledge read. Now, a little note, two notes about that. You will notice there are two phrases missing from that pledge. One, under God. God didn't show up in the pledge until the 1950s. And of the United States, which didn't come in until the 1920s. Bellamy was still around, and he objected to it. Because you see, Francis Bellamy, and if you think for a moment about how certain people, particularly on the far right, sort of almost use the pledge as a cudgel to beat people, Francis Bellamy didn't want the United States in there because, well, he was a socialist, and he was a globalist. And he thought that it could be something that would be affirming to people wherever they lived. That it shouldn't just be us, it could be anyone. That it wasn't so much just as the words of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness aren't just a self-fulfilling prophecy. You have to aspire to these things, and you have to work for them. So the pledge in its original form was very different from what it was today, and I sometimes wonder if some of the people on the right who are so often sort of refer to originalism, that everything should just be the way it was. Well, would they agree then in the spirit of that to take out under God? And while we're at it, take out of the United States? I don't think so. I think they are 100% for originalism except when they're 100% against it. So that's just a little personal story that I think relates to the mission of your organization. I actually, in talking about population though, I want to go back a little farther. I want to go back to 1790, and I promise you this won't be like one of those wonderful novels by James Michener where you keep waiting to, okay, great, could we move into this millennium? But a quick story. In 1790, that was the first full year that George Washington served in the White House. He took office in 1789 in March. That year, 1790, a child was born in Virginia named John Tyler. 50 years later, John Tyler became the 10th President of the United States. Unless you're a real buff, the only thing you remember about John Tyler is the campaign slogan on which he and William Henry Harrison ran that year. Tip a canoe and Tyler too. That's about it. Well, William Henry Harrison gave the longest inaugural address in American history on a cold day in March. He fell ill and died about a month and a half later, and so John Tyler got to be president that way. Why do I bring up John Tyler? What does he have to do with population? Well, here's what he has to do with it. When John Tyler was born, there were about 1 billion people on the planet. Today, there are 7 billion. John Tyler's grandson, Harrison Tyler, is still alive and well. And so, in Virginia of all places. And so within the space of 3 human generations, long ones, but nonetheless 3 human generations, we've gone from 1 billion people to 7 billion. We added that last billion in the last 12 years. And what I'd like to talk about tonight is a little bit about population, and then connect it very much to the current political challenges that we face, and to the culture war that's really been going on in this country, at least for the last 40 years, on a variety of issues, including issues around women's rights, family planning, and a whole lot of other things. But when you look at population, what you see right now is a singular phenomenon. We were a slow starter as a species. It took us a long time to get going. And it wasn't until, again, around 1800 that we began to really grow our population. I mean, keep in mind, it took, what, 10,000 generations to get to 1 billion. And now we've gone from 1 billion to 7 billion in 3. The thing that changed was actually one of the most positive and remarkable developments in human history. What it was this: when children began surviving their childhoods, starting in the early 1800s, because of the advent of the earliest forms of modern medicine, basic sanitation, clean water. I served on a panel with a doctor from Stanford who said 50% of public health is soap and clean water. Everything else is the other half. And so if you were to walk just a few blocks from here to an old cemetery, you will see nestled back in the corners tiny little gravestones of children who died at 17 days or 3 months. You know, in colonial times, women in America had 7 children each. It's just that most of them didn't survive. And so this miraculous event occurred, and children began to survive their childhood. And that's what's been the driving force behind population growth. Even positive things can have challenging outcomes. I mean, if you win the lottery, you'll suddenly discover you have friends and relatives you never knew you had. So, you know, and this is a case, in a way, that we won a lottery. It's a wonderful thing. But even wonderful things have challenging outcomes. It isn't so much that we're living that much longer. You know, until Ronald Reagan, the longest-lived U.S. president, was our second president, John Adams. And I hate to bring this up, but I would point out that despite all the advances in modern science, the mortality rate is holding at 100%. Nobody seems to be able to do much about that one. So good luck with the Stairmaster and all that stuff. It may help for a while, but it'll be temporary. So we have this situation now where we have this sudden explosion of population. Now, when our group was founded in 1968, you could make a pretty good case that this population explosion was happening pretty much everywhere. There were a couple of exceptions, like Japan, but it was pretty much worldwide. And the reason it came to the public's attention in 1968 was first kind of, the obvious reason was because of a book that was written. And it was a book called The Population Bomb, written by a professor at Stanford, a young professor, an entomologist, not a demographer. He's a bug guy, was and is, studies butterflies. Well, he wrote this very short book called The Population Bomb. And the way that came to pass was the year before, the United States had just turned 200 million people, reached 200 million people. He wrote an article for a magazine, and a man named David Brower, who was head of the Sierra Club, said, "Why don't you turn it into a book, we'll publish it." And so he did. And in fact, Paul Ehrlich will be the first to tell you he didn't write the book. He co-wrote the book with his wife, Anne, but at the time they said, well, we can't have her name on it. You know, so we'll just put your name on it. And since then, they've co-written many books together and have worked closely together. And by the way, he was a young scientist at Stanford then, and he's a not quite so young scientist at Stanford now. And it was an interesting book, but the reason, it was sort of the inconvenient truth of its day. It caught fire and captured the public interest. And the reason, I think, was because it came at the exact right time. If that book had been written 10 years earlier or 10 years later, and there have been lots of books written on population for a long time, I don't think it would have had the impact it did. Because something was happening right around that time here in the United States. And it was a dramatic shift in our country. When John F. Kennedy was inaugurated president in 1961, the average woman in the United States had 3.4 children each. By the time Jimmy Carter was sworn into office, only 16 years later, that's less than even a short generation, that had dropped by 50% to 1.7 children. And the reason that happened wasn't because of some calamity or disaster, nor was it because of some bureaucrat or commissar telling people what to do. It was the aggregate of tens of millions of individual decisions. And those decisions were derived from a series of events and circumstances that all came together at the same time. First of all, the birth control pill was approved for general use in this country in 1964. I would challenge you to name a single technological innovation of the 20th century that has had and may continue to have more opportunity to improve the world than that. Because for the first time in the world, half the people on Earth are no longer dependent on the other half of the people on Earth for their outcome of their lives. You know, I mentioned the lottery earlier, perhaps I did. Marriage is a bit of a lottery. It would be great if every single ticket was a winner, but not all of them seem to be, you know. And this way, for the first time, women had this opportunity to control the trajectory of their lives because of this change in technology. But it went beyond technology. Another thing that happened was in the 60s, starting late 50s, early 60s, and on into the 70s, women began to go to college in great numbers in the United States. It certainly wasn't unheard of before that for a woman to go to college. My grandmother graduated from Bryn Mawr in 1896 with a degree in math. But that was atypical in those days. Today, as should be the case, we don't think anything of it if a young woman graduates from Bryn Mawr or Temple or anywhere else with a math degree. What'd you major in? Math? Well, that's nice. You go on and talk about something else. But women began to go to college in great numbers in the 60s and 70s. And a couple of things happen when women get more education. One, all kinds of doors open. Some of them have to be pried open, and some of them aren't as open as they should be, but a lot has changed in the last several generations, really. And so, you know, women in the past were sort of, you know, homemaker, and I don't mean in any way to disparage that honorable and important role, whether a man or woman carries it out, homemaker, but for women beyond that, it was, do you want to be a teacher? Do you want to be a secretary? Do you want to be a nurse? All wonderful and honorable things. Sometimes, and I'm going way off topic here, I think one of the challenges that we may face in our education system that never gets talked about was precisely because women's options were so narrow 50 and 60 years ago. One of the few places they could go to carry out their talents was education. Now they have a much broader array of opportunities, and I'm just sort of pointing that out, that the best and brightest, some of them now are doctors and lawyers and engineers and scientists. So, you know, the world's gain may have been to some extent our loss in schools to some bit. But back to my point, beyond education, beyond technology, there were great changes in law. Because starting in the 1960s, the Supreme Court recognized the notion of a right to privacy. Now, you won't find those words in the Constitution. You won't find a lot of words in the Constitution that people talk about. But back in 1890, future Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis co-wrote probably the most important law review article ever published in the Harvard Law Review, which put forward the notion of a right to privacy. And the idea was this: the Fourth Amendment talks about your ability to be secure from unreasonable search and seizure. Well, Brandeis and his partner reasoned, his law partner reasoned, that if you're secure in your home, how can you not be secure in your person? You know, to paraphrase George Carlin, your person is the home you take with you wherever you go. And how could you have a situation where you're secure from interference in your home, but you don't have a right to personal privacy? And interestingly, in the first paragraph of that law review article, in laying out their case, they used the phrase right to life. And what they meant by that phrase was the right to a private, personal life. and I have to give our opponents great credit for knowing a good phrase. They took the pledge, they took this great phrase. You know, they're not the originators, but they seem to do a very good job of picking up some good phrases along the way and making them their own. But what happened was the court decided that first married couples, then individuals, had a right to use contraception. And that didn't come to pass until the 1960s. And then in 1970, and early 70s, and then in 1972, in the Roe v. Wade decision, the court, through some fairly tortured reasoning, frankly, at least accepted the notion that a right to privacy encompasses the right of a woman to make decisions about a pregnancy. And of course, we're still fighting about that to this day. And frankly, a lot of the people on the right, and they'll tell you this, do not accept the notion of a right to privacy. They say it's not in the Constitution. Next time somebody says that to you, say, well, guess what? Under God wasn't in the pledge. So you go first. You agree to stop saying the pledge without the U.S. and under God, then I'll listen to your arguments on this constitutional stuff. So all of these changes happened at the same time, along with the Cultural Revolution that changed the way women saw themselves and the way the whole culture saw women. And the result was this 50% drop in family size in 16 years. And now what we're seeing around the world is these same challenges playing out in other countries. Some countries are making enormous progress. Other countries are being completely left behind. But it always comes back to access to contraception, the notion of women having the right of recognizing, rather, a woman's right to be whoever she wants to be and can be, and the notion of protecting personal choices. And we're fighting these battles. It's almost like we keep refighting the 12th century over and over again. And I want to tell you a couple of success stories, if I might. One is, and I'm picking these because I think they're thought-provoking. One is Iran. Now, I don't much care for their foreign policy myself, but that's beside the point. In the mid-1980s, Iran, which is a 98% Muslim nation, and the name of it is Islamic Republic of Iran. It is a theocracy. I do not want to live in a theocracy. But to their credit, in the mid-80s, women there were having 6.5 children each. And believe it or not, the leaders, the men, the leaders in Iran saw this as a problem, and they did 5 things. And I would submit to you that anyone in this room would probably find favor with each of these 5. Maybe it would. One, they built a condom factory and made contraception essentially available for all, regardless of ability to pay. 2, they dramatically increased women's education. 2/3 of the university students in Iran are women. 3, they used their television and radio to promote through public service ads, family planning, and contraception. 4, and this is an interesting one, it's the only country I know of where before you can get married, and you don't just move in together in Iran, that's not happening. When you go in to get a marriage license, you have to show that you took a course in family planning. It's a little like before you can get out on 95 in a car, you should have a little driver training. It seems to make sense. And finally, believe it or not, the Muslim religious leaders in Iran put out a series of pronouncements to the following effect. They said, tranquility is an Islamic virtue, and small families are more tranquil. Now, as the parent of grown children, I can tell you that children bring many gifts. The gift of tranquility is not one of them. Neither are they a good financial investment. They have other qualities, but not those. What happened? Within 16 years, and isn't it interesting that it was the same period of time that it took in the United States? They went from 6.5 children to 2, with no coercion. I've met with an OBGYN who practices in Iran, and she confirms what the data says. No coercion, no heavy-handed interference, no effort to do that, just doing good, sensible things. So I think we have to sort of be a little cautious when we paint with too broad a brush. I mean, just as when one refers to, say, Christianity here in the United States, You've got the Roman Catholics and the Greek Orthodox, but you got the Methodists and you got the Congregationalists and you got all manner of Baptists of all sorts of descriptions depending upon where you come from. Francis Bellamy was a Baptist, one of those New England Baptists, which were the sort of the free thinkers of their day. So we have to be a little careful, I think, in not assuming that people are one way or another. You've got to look past the labels. You've got to look past the labels. The other great success story I want to tell you about is Mexico. 1970, women had 6.8 children each. Very Catholic country. But you know something about Mexico? They have a very long, century-old tradition of separation of church and state, which I hope their neighbor to the north keeps in mind. They respect the right of the church to work in the realm of the spirit, but it's not allowed to interfere with the government. So what they did starting in 1970 in Mexico was build a network of literacy centers, build a network of family planning clinics that your tax dollars, if you're around then, help to pay for. And incidentally, that's not true anymore, but for a good reason, not a bad reason. And finally, they have sex education nationwide that leaves nothing to the imagination, because it turns out that adolescents not only have fertile imaginations, they have fertile other things, and you want to get there first with the facts. You want to get there first with the facts, and that's what they do in Mexico. So what happened in Mexico? 1970, 6.8 children each. Today, the average woman in Mexico has somewhere between 2.2 and 2.3 children. 2.1 is replacement rate. Couple has 2 kids, pretty basic. That's amazing. You know, if that hadn't happened in Mexico, instead of having a population today of 120 million, they would have had an additional 50 million unplanned births. So if you ever hear anybody say that the reason there's all this immigration of the last few years from Mexico is because women are having huge families, that's just not true. I mean, people are entitled to their own opinions. They're not, as the saying goes, entitled to their own facts. But the fact is, despite these great success stories here in the United States, and we have a lot of unfinished business on many issues, including population, but we've made great progress. Despite these success stories, population growth remains a huge challenge. 98% of all population growth occurs in the poorest places on Earth. The poorest places on Earth. 40% of the world lacks access to indoor plumbing or modern sanitation. Think about that for a minute. That was a huge breakthrough 200 years ago, so I'm not anti-technology at all. But let's just remember that that bit of technology hasn't gotten to 4 out of 10 of us yet. In India, more people have some version of one of these, a cell phone, than have access to indoor plumbing. Because once you figure out whatever's going on in this box, it's not that tricky to build some towers and cell phones. But imagine if you had to put indoor plumbing, a modern sanitation system in a huge, poverty-stricken, disorganized Indian city with pipes to every unit and treatment plants, and who's going to pay for it? And so these tremendous challenges remain. You know, Africa is by and large, with noteworthy exceptions, a disaster area. The country of Niger in Central Africa, women have 7.4 children each. And they see those children die at a very young age. We read occasionally about Somalia. Women there have about 6 children each. The average person in Somalia lives on less than $600 a year. Only 2 to 3% of the land is farmable. They used to make their living, a lot of the people, by fishing. They made their living by fishing because it has the longest coastline in Africa. They can't do that anymore, and one of the reasons they can't do that, by and large, is because the mega trawlers that sucked all of the fish out of the North Atlantic are now fishing illegally in the Indian Ocean, and they're scooping up all the fish, and the fishermen can't compete. So what, you know, and I don't mean to sound flippant about this, but on career day in Somalia, if they had such a thing, you go in and there's 2 tables, famine victim and pirate. Which one do you pick? You know, one of the people who got a ship taken hostage by Somali pirates said, I have something in common with these pirates. I don't want them to have my ship, and they don't want it either. We're just trying to figure out a way to negotiate a solution. No, I'm not pro-piracy. I'm just saying that when people are starving, when they have no choices, when they can't migrate, when they can't grow food, when their livelihood has been taken away from them, they're going to do something. You know, a UN official said that when poor people get hungry, when they can't afford to pay for food, one of three things always happens. They starve, they migrate, or they revolt or take some other illegal action. Those are your three choices. You can starve to death, you can migrate, or you can take some kind of extra legal action. And today, it's not so much that we don't produce enough food for everybody. There's enough food produced for every person on earth to have a decent diet if we all adopted the diet of the Indian subcontinent, the traditional Indian diet. Lots of vegetables, lots of rice, very little animal protein. It was Thomas Jefferson, by the way, who said that he thought meat should be more of a condiment than a main course. That a little bit of meat on the side was sort of Thomas Jefferson. He was right about a lot of things, including more than the First Amendment, among other things. Not just sure about number 2, but we'll leave that for another day. Nobody's perfect, but the point I'm making, though, is that to say that it's just a distribution problem would be like telling those Chilean miners a year and a half ago who were 2,000 feet underground that they weren't out of oxygen, it was just a distribution problem. It is a huge problem, because at the same time, if everybody ate the American diet on Earth, 2 billion people would get to eat, 5 billion people would get nothing. And in fact, what's happening in places like China is more and more people are adopting the American diet. Now, I have friends who will tell you the next big crisis is going to be oil. I have friends who will tell you the next big crisis is going to be food. I have friends who say, oh, no, it's fresh water, it's water. Nobody really knows. But one of the things that's happening now is that food is becoming fuel. If you look at the amount of corn that it takes to make enough ethanol to fill an SUV tank, a big SUV tank, once, that would feed a person for a year. So who's going to win that battle? The guy at the gas station with his big SUV with his credit card? Or the guy who has nothing to eat? One tank would feed a person. The corn that it takes to fill one tank with ethanol, the big SUV, would feed a person for a year. So these problems are distribution problems, but one of the ways to get at it is by addressing population. And the good news is that there's this confluence. All you need to do, and it's not easy, but it's straightforward, is to apply the principles I started talking about here. Empowerment of women, education, access to contraception. And on these issues, from time to time, the United States has enjoyed a really good track record. 40 years ago, when we started funding international family planning, the person behind that was a fellow named Richard M. Nixon, who incidentally also started the EPA, where I didn't work for them then, but later. Back in the day, these were not partisan issues. That's what's interesting about this. George W. Bush's grandfather, H.W.'s father, was a senator from Connecticut named Prescott Bush. You can look on the internet. In 1947, when Margaret Sanger did her first national fundraising campaign, Prescott Bush was her treasurer. When George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, Poppy, was a young member of Congress from Texas, he was so involved in family planning that his nickname, and I'm not making this up, on the Hill was Rubbers Bush. Because he was always talking about it. You had people like Gerald Ford who were great on these issues. You had, even that rascal Nixon was fine. It was really Republicans, kind of Northeastern Republicans, who got the ball rolling on this. But things have changed. And what we're now in the middle of is a culture war. And in my view, this culture war has been going on for about 40 years. And somewhat ironically, it was Nixon who got it started after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, when he saw an opportunity to drive a wedge in southern states and push southern voters away from the Democratic Party on the issue of civil rights. Eventually, that card, thankfully, didn't work anymore with the vast majority of voters. But they found a way to slip other cards in there, saying, oh, everybody's going to have to marry somebody who's gay, or I don't know what they're saying, but they're saying something. I've never quite understood what Somebody else has to do with my marriage. I've never quite figured that out, but they seem to be worried about it. Or around a woman's right to choose, or the rights of basic contraception. You know, in a way, it goes all the way back to the Civil War. The message that's often portrayed is, oh, it's some more of those smarty Northerners coming down here to tell us what to do, just like they've been doing for 150 years. So we're in the middle of this culture war, and family planning is at the heart of it. I'll give you an example. And I don't mean to be partisan. I would not like nothing more. We're a nonpartisan organization at Population Connection. We were started, by the way, under the name Zero Population Growth. And I'll close in a minute just by telling you a little bit about what we do, and then we get into a discussion. We're not partisan. I only wish that both parties were competing to show who could do more on these issues. That would be wonderful. Nothing could please me more. But the fact is that's not what's happening. Let me tell you about a vote that was taken in the House Foreign Affairs Committee a few months ago. I'm sorry to say, the Republicans on the committee wanted to eliminate all funding for UN family planning. We give about $50 million a year to the UN for family planning assistance. And their argument was, they said, well, the UN is assisting in coercive practices in China. Well, there are a couple of problems with that. Number one, the UN does work in China, but their work very specifically is in rural provinces to show provincial officials that voluntary programs are better. So they got it completely backwards. Second, under existing law, not one penny of US funding that goes to the UN goes to China. So, you know, the whole thing was a canard. But they said because the UN is in China, we don't want to see any money from the United States going to this agency called the UNFPA, the UN Family Planning Group. So other members, Democrats on the committee, decided to kind of call their bluff. And they put up a series of amendments. And one of the amendments said the following. They said, okay, we disagree with you in principle, but we're willing to concede the point. How about this? Not one penny of the money we would give to the UN for this would go for any family planning. 100% of the money would go for, and all of it would go for only one thing. That is to provide birthing kits to women in refugee camps. Women who are victims of war or natural disaster, so that when they give birth in this muddy camp, I'm not saying this as a matter of hyperbole, but as a matter of fact. So they'd have a piece of plastic to give birth. So they'd have some sterile materials, so that they could give birth safely. I'm sorry to say that every single Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee voted no. Voted no. So when we hear that the problem is that we're not coming together, it's just not true. There's no middle to go to anymore. You know, I'm not a big fan of a former U.S. Senator named Jesse Helms, late of North Carolina. He was an ultra-conservative. In 1973, he put forward an amendment, and the amendment said the following. Since there's such sharp discord in this country over abortion, why don't we do this with our family planning money? Why don't we say that not one penny of U.S. family planning money can go for abortion internationally? Not one penny. All of our money has to go to help with birth control and related things. Well, that amendment passed. Now, if I were in charge, the amendment would be gone, because I'm pro-choice, but that's not the point. That was the compromise. If you want to talk about a reasonable compromise, we said, okay, or those who were around then, I wasn't, said, okay, we'll accept that. The money will only go for family planning. And yet, consistently, Reagan and Bush and the Republicans in the House and the Senate want to see these programs decimated. And I don't think it's because they really are, some of them are opposed to them, but mostly it's because of this culture war. The only approach that works for them is a scorched earth approach. They are incapable of saying, well, I sort of see your point, I don't really agree, but maybe we can find a way to work this out. I wish that were the case. You know, the fellow who beat my boss, Peter Kostmeyer, was a Republican named Jim Greenwood, who served for the next 12 years in Congress. You know, he and I were, believe it or not, opposing campaign managers 30 plus years ago. Jim Greenwood was great on family planning. He was a Republican. He couldn't have had a better record on it. In fact, he said one of the most memorable things I ever heard on this issue. He stood on the floor of the House and said to his Republican, well, his colleagues, but especially to the Republicans, he said about women in Africa who are in need of family planning, he said, don't any of you say or think for a moment that these women don't love and care for their children as much as any woman does. He said every single one of them would walk barefoot across broken glass to save her child if she could. But it's not that simple. It's not that easy. But sadly, people like Jim Greenwood, who I disagreed with on many things, but he was great on this issue and was what we used to call a modern Republican, there's no real room for them anymore. There's no room for that kind of reason. And it's a real shame. Now, the good news is that when Barack Obama took office, along with Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi, and I want to talk about Reid in a moment for a second, they increased funding. Essentially, they reversed what Bush did. Obama eliminated this thing called the global gag rule that tied the hands of family planning programs, restored funding for the UN, and increased funding by 40%. Now that 40% is a pretty big increase in the middle of the Great Recession. So we were very pleased to see that. And I want to say a word about Harry Reid, who, you know, doesn't maybe get all the plaudits that some people do. Harry Reid, I would note, is a Mormon convert. Harry Reid is against abortion. However, Harry Reid, and I've sat in a small room with him and talked about this with 15 other people, is a big supporter of family planning. Harry Reid is a big supporter of sex education. Not only because he believes in these things, but because he says the best way to avert abortion is by enabling women to have access to information and services. You know, it's a medical fact that in the history of the world, you can look this up, not one woman ever had an abortion who wasn't pregnant. It's never happened. Try going into a clinic and demanding a good luck. They would say, I want an abortion. Well, okay, how long are you pregnant? I'm not pregnant. Well, sorry. You know, we don't hate to discriminate, but we can't help you. Harry Reid, interestingly enough, does not allow his personal objection to abortion to interfere with the operations of the Senate. He does not use his position as majority leader to block bills or to try to impede things. He encourages every member of the caucus to vote his conscience on this. And I'll say a word about our senior senator, Bob Casey. When Bob Casey ran for the Senate here, Bob Casey, just like his father before him, who had a tremendous record on environmental issues and many other issues, but was adamantly against abortion in all cases, Bob Casey Jr. said, in effect, I'm my father's son, I will never support anything to do with abortion, but I will support sex ed and I will support family planning. And to his credit, he's, you know, he didn't, there's truth in advertising. That's what he said when he ran, and that's what he's done. So, you know, you do have people who can kind of see their way through these complexities, but so many can't. And it's all part of this culture war. And you know, culture wars tend to go on for a long time. I think we'll still be fighting this war 40 years from now. Because whatever else we want to say about our opponents, we cannot accuse them of lacking enthusiasm. If you want to say one nice thing about them, that would be it. They sure are enthusiastic. And all you have to do is look at what's going on in the Republican primaries now to see that. But these battles are so important. If we did everything right, starting today, and by everything right, I mean voluntary programs worldwide, the UN says we could stabilize global population within 30 years. That's pretty fast for a phenomenon that we've had for 200 plus years. But it's equally likely, in fact, it's more likely that population is continue to grow 1 billion every 10, 15, 20 years, maybe 15 to 20 years, on past this century. And something's going to give. If Africa grows, and its current rate, it's projected to grow from 1 billion people to 4 billion people. And it can't support 1 billion people today. What's going to happen? Is it going to be famine? Is it going to be disease? Is it going to be war? Is it going to be massive migration of desperate people in rafts just trying to get across the Mediterranean just for some possibility of something? It's going to be a disaster, a natural disaster and a human disaster. And the terrible thing about this is one issue, and I'll close with this comment before I just mention a word about us. Population is the only global challenge I know of where the following three things are all true. We know how to fix it. We know where babies come from. There's been research done on this. Not all of it, some of it volunteer. Contraception really works. Two, providing these programs is relatively inexpensive. For example, it costs $22 a year to provide a woman in a developing world with contraception. That's pretty reasonable. And three, whenever women especially, couples too, whenever women have the opportunity to control the trajectory of their lives, they choose to have smaller families. It is a fact that when women have the choice and the education, they choose smaller families. It is an observation on my part, not a fact, that when women's income goes up, families get smaller. It's an observation on my part, when men's income goes up, televisions get bigger. And Freud might have something to say about that, but I'll stay out of it. So just a word before we get into a little discussion maybe about population connection. We were founded as Zero Population Growth back in 1968, changed our name about 10 years ago, and if anybody wants to chat about that, we can. We have about 145,000 people who help us one way or another. If we have some of our donors here tonight, thank you so much. But we have, among other things, 50,000 participating educators. We reach 3 million students in the United States every year in kindergarten through 12th grade classrooms with population information. We don't try to tell a single one of them what to think. We just try to get them to think. We're just trying to get them to think about population challenges, form their own opinions, look at the facts, reach the conclusions that make sense to them. The other half of our work is with a group that we do try to tell what to think, and that's the 535 women and men in Congress. And we do our best, just like the good folks at Americans United do, to advocate and lobby. And we lobby and advocate especially for family planning. I've talked a lot about the international scene. The same thing is happening in this country with efforts on the part of the radical right, which seems to be most of the right these days, to curtail programs every way they possibly can. And various, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here, I do not, but it runs the gamut from people who are quite reasonably, even if I disagree with them, using their rights as citizens to lobby and advocate. They have the same rights we do, and I respect those rights, even though I wish they'd come to their senses, to people on the far end who engage in acts of domestic terrorism, like the assassination of Dr. George Tiller, a doctor who provided women with whatever services they needed in Wichita, Kansas, and who 2.5 years ago was assassinated while serving as an usher in his church. I've had a chance to meet Dr. Tiller's family, his widow and his children, and they told me about their father. And they told me that all he wanted to do, and he told his old staff, we're here to serve the women who come here. We're not here to make judgments about them. We're here to give them the medical services they feel they need. And just to give you a flavor of the kind of guy he was, because you know how the right likes to paint everybody who disagrees with him as, you know, it's like everybody lives in Greenwich Village. Lovely place, by the way, but not everybody does. Well, his family said something interesting. They said, you know, it was one of the kids who said, you know, Dad had a saying. And this kid, the grown child said, what Dad used to say is when the going gets tough, and the whole family chimed in and said, the tough go to Dairy Queen. That's the kind of father they had, who just was a straightforward guy who wanted to help women, and he was gunned down in church. And again, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I think the kind of inflammatory rhetoric and the kind of mean-spirited politics that we see helps to provide a breeding ground for that kind of hate, however inadvertent it may be, and however much those folks may legitimately condemn it. We're going to have to, we may not have thought our way into this mess, but we're going to have to think our way out of it. And I think that's something on which we and the folks at Americans United can agree. So with that, I'll stop talking and get questions, comments, what have you. Yes, sir.
This question isn't directly related to population growth, but I think it's related to one of the reasons why you care about population growth, which is, world hunger.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on the mostly, I guess, new age source groups that try and challenge genetically modified crops and the impact to, potential discoveries that can happen to help with world hunger?
Well, first of all, in 1970, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a man named Norman Borlaug, who was the father of the Green Revolution, which used all sorts of improvements in cultivation techniques and fertilizers, including a lot of fertilizers developed from oil. What Borlaug said, and I think this is a good place to start, in his acceptance speech in 1970, he said, everything, and he probably saved more lives, he and his team saved more lives than any other human being who ever lived. Probably 1 billion people owed their survival to Norman Borlaug and his team. Think about that, 1 billion people. In his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, he said, none of it's going to do any good if we don't deal with population. You know, what we're coming to, and I try really hard not to have too strong opinions about things that I'm not up here to just tell you things I don't know anything about. So you probably know much more about that subject than I do. My take on it is this, that what we see, if you have to go from here to Wilmington, Delaware, you could definitely take a plane to Dubai and a ship to Beijing and another plane to Los Angeles and then ride a bicycle to Wilmington. Or you could go to Wilmington. And I think if I could carry my analogy here, we have these incredibly inexpensive, desirable, voluntary methods to reduce demand for food. And what we're pushing ourselves into instead are expensive, elaborate methods to increase the supply. And rather than looking at simple methods of reducing demand, Amory Lovins, who's written a lot about energy issues, coined a great phrase, maybe you're familiar with it, called the negawatt. And everybody knows a megawatt, is a term used in electricity. Well, he came up with a negawatt, and he pointed out to some big utilities, and to their credit, some of them did this, that it was cheaper for them to give people subsidies to buy new appliances than it was to fund a nuclear power plant. That by subsidizing to consumers, the purchase of low utilities, appliances that used very little electricity, you in effect generated more electricity than you did by the multi-billion-dollar risky investment in a nuclear power plant. So what I would say to all of this is by reducing demand, which occurs when people have the opportunity to have smaller families, you eliminate a lot of these problems from the get-go. Remember what Will Rogers said about real estate, why he invested in it, because he said they ain't making any more of it. I mean, the problem is with all of this is that in many places we're already overshot. There's no way that you're going to be able to produce the kind of food and fresh water that people need. But within less than a generation, you can transform a society with family planning and eliminate a lot of that pressure. Didn't really answer your question, but didn't really know the answer, so I gave you an answer to a different question. I did work for a politician for a while. Yes?
What kind of challenges are we anticipating in the future as far as attacks on reproductive rights and attacks on family planning programs?
Endless and relentless. Endless and relentless. And, let's look at the politics right now. We are and I'm not speaking in a partisan sense, but in the sense of where people line up, we are a distinct minority in the House of Representatives. If you go back 25 years, what's really changed there is you've always had 20 or 30 Democrats who were pretty iffy on family planning for various reasons. Either they represent rural South Carolina, or they're members who are from constituencies, some heavily Catholic constituencies, and all the rest. That's always been the given. What's happened is this vanishing of the 30 to 40 members of the moderate wing of the Republican Party that were around 30 or 40 years ago. So our minority status on these issues in the House is worse than the partisan breakdown would indicate. On the other hand, if you look at the Senate, we have a very thin majority there. There are 53 Democrats in the U.S. Senate right now. One of them, who's retiring, Ben Nelson, is never any good on these issues, rarely. Two of them, on their terms of their personal votes, it depends on how the issue is framed, and that's Casey and Reed. On family planning, usually okay. On abortion, not. You have up to 4 Republicans, the 2 women from Maine, Snow and Collins, who are generally quite good. You have a new freshman Republican from Illinois, Mark Kirk, who's generally good. And you have Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Alaska, who's generally pretty good. But the odds are, I'd say it's a flip of a coin as to whether the Democrats or Republicans will control the Senate next year. And if the Republicans take control of the Senate, the first vote of the year is the most important one. Because what they will do is install all of their key leaders as chairs on committees. And a lot of those people are way to the right. Now, if the White House were to change hands, all bets are off at that point. You know, anything could happen. Anything could happen. I don't think you can exclude anything from possibility if you have an anti-choice House, as we have now, an anti-choice Senate, which could happen, and, you know, whatever's going on with the Republicans, which, you know, if you can figure out Mitt Romney, you're a better person than I am. Yes, sir.
So just to follow up on that, given the current composition of the Supreme Court, do you think any chance they would overturn Roe v. Wade, or any, you know, which way would they go? Because even if everything else goes, if it gets challenged, you know, they're the final thing.
The broader strategy, and I'm not talking about the terrorists, but the broader strategy of these are people who operate within. I'm referring rather to people whose point of view terrifies me, but who generally operate within the realm of what we're all entitled to do in politics. Their strategy is they'd love to see that happen, but that's not really their main strategy. Their main strategy is death by 1,000 cuts. They try to make it so difficult. There was a measure that a court struck down in Kansas that put a special requirement overnight on abortion clinics in Kansas, specifying how large the janitorial closets had to be. And it literally was within 4 days of when it was passed, they all had to comply. No other medical clinic had to do this. You know, you have situations where there are states where women are virtually unable to access abortion services now. There are this sort of constant pressure to make it as difficult as possible, to put as much pressure as you possibly can. You know, I'm very proud of we're a small organization, I'm very proud of some of the young to me anyway, young women who work for us who volunteer to do clinic defense work. But I do want to tell you, just so we're not too heavy-handed about this, a somewhat lighthearted story. One of the clinics they do it at is in Silver Spring, Maryland. And the clinic is located in a suburban, typical office building. So they'll be there doing clinic defense, and the anti-choice protesters are yelling at women, no, stop, don't do it, don't do it. Well, in addition to the abortion clinic, there are also dentists and accountants in that building. And so I go, what? I'm not supposed to get my teeth cleaned? I'm not supposed to do what is it you don't want me to do? You know, I thought it would be a good idea to get this cavity fixed. I don't mean to make light of the issue. But I think it's less likely that Roe v. Wade will be overturned than it'll be this constant nibbling away at the thing on every level. Local, state, federal, just making it as difficult as possible for women. Now, the one thing that's happening now is about 15 to 17% of all abortions in this country are now pharmaceutical through pills that women can take. And that makes it very, very difficult for the protesters outside the clinics, because a woman can go to any doctor, she gets a couple pills, takes one, goes home, sits quietly, they suggest having a friend around, takes another pill, and you know, within a day or two, the whole process is completed, and she just needs to go back to her doctor for a checkup. So that's, you know, that's a huge breakthrough, because it's going to be harder and harder for the other side to interfere in that process. Yes, in the back and in the middle here.
It seems to me that most places where